And then before I start screen sharing, I'm just going to do a quick intro. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabe Laredo. I'm the program manager at Leeway, and I'm going to be taking us through today's info session. I'm also going to kick it over to my colleague Maria, who's going to be helping out with tech and answering some questions.
Hi, all. Maria Villafranca. I'm the deputy director at Leeway.
And then I'd like to pass it over to our guest grantee, Imran. Imran, can you just give us a quick intro, name, pronouns, and a little bit about your artistic practice to start?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I'm Imran. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a writer and filmmaker interested in challenging systems of domination. Yeah, I can say more later, but yeah, that's what I do.
All right. All right, let's get started. Bear with me, folks, while I pull up this PowerPoint and get us started. Okay. And just so you know, this is a bilingual presentation. The pink is the Spanish throughout the entire slideshow, just to help you guys navigate. So who is Leeway Foundation? We are a foundation supporting women, trans, and gender nonconforming artists and cultural producers who live in the greater Philadelphia area. So that's Philadelphia counties and the surrounding counties of Bucks, Camden, Chester, Delaware, and Montgomery. Most of our grants are for individual artists or collectives. So we don't really fund organizations, although one of our programs does require an organizational partner. But for the most part, our funds are going directly towards individual artists. You can apply to this grant program and our other programs with a co-applicant or as a collective. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. And then throughout the slideshow, you'll see some artwork that's featured from some of our past transformation awardees. Here we see some really lovely, colorful artwork from painter and curator Chelsea Lester. And then let's kind of talk about art for social change, which is at the crux of a lot of kind of what Leeway um, art funds, right? We fund art at the intersection of communities and social change, right? And what that means is that the artwork that we fund has a vision and an intentional analysis, right? So we kind of think about it as what is the ripple effect of the work that you're producing, right? What's your vision for change that your work is working towards, right? Typically, it's not impacting just a few individuals, but communities. And oftentimes, that doesn't necessarily have to mean like a massive portion of the population. It could be your neighborhood, it could be change starting in your friend group and spreading outwards. It doesn't have to be, it's often like people can sometimes think that this award is for people doing these like monumental things, and it is for that as well. But change can also start small, right? And so questions to really ask yourself when you're putting together this application is how does your art create action and how does your art engage slash impact community? And on this slide, there's actually a still from one of Imran's short films. Imran, do you want to talk a bit about this work sample?
Sure. Yeah, this is a film called The Difference Between Us that we made in 2023. It's about a Bangladeshi uh, immigrant who's undocumented, who's looking for an apartment in Philly and ends up taking a sublet in a weird situation where they haven't yet seen their roommate. Um, so it kind of explores what I think of as longing, um, longing in the sense of longing for love, for liberation as a queer person, but also as a person in a diaspora, longing for where you come from. And yeah, that's kind of what it's about.
We'll talk more about this later in the presentation, but Leeway's applications ask you to select your social change intents, right? You're given a list of different social change areas, and you're asked to select at least one, but no more than three. Imran, you selected feminism, racial justice, and transgender justice slash gender self-determination. Can you talk a little bit about how your work speaks to those impact areas?
Yeah, and I think this film is a good example of this idea of another world, and believing that for trans people, particularly trans people of color, that another world is possible. I'm really interested in reaching for things that are just out of reach, but still reaching for them. And so my background, even as a writer and as a organizer or as a nonprofit worker, is also in feminism, racial justice. And so I picked those things because they're the things that matter most to me. And so I also write essays. I write about representations of gender, race, and culture, from this same lens. And yeah, ultimately, as I mentioned at the top, like trying to challenge systems of domination and
Mhm.
believing that it is possible for us to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that like the work to envision possible futures comes up a lot in the applications for the transformational award I've seen. If you're wondering what you might already know, but if you're kind of like thinking to yourself, like, well, what is the impact of my work? What is the vision behind my work? Something that I think is really helpful. If you look at the guidelines for this application, on page 2, there's a section called Art for Social Change, What We Mean. And I find it very helpful, a list of what art for social change may accomplish, right? And there's examples like raise consciousness, create space for expression, for community building, challenge various oppressions, um, create a vision for a more just world. Some of these are more concrete than others, but they're all just as impactful, I think. So that's a really helpful list if you need somewhere to start in terms of thinking about the impact of your work.
Imran, just before we move on, there's a question in
Mhm.
the chat about where we can watch your film from The Difference Between Us.
Yeah, you could email me. It's technically available, but it's also still um, at some festivals and stuff. But yeah, it's definitely available. If you email me, I will send it to you.
Imran, do you mind if we share your email with folks in the follow-up email to this session?
Not at all.
Cool. Awesome. All right, so moving on to what do we fund and who decides? So this award is open to artists working in any medium, including traditional and non-traditional practices. So of course we see painters, we see dancers and actors. We also see curators. We also see cultural producers, and hair braiders, DJs, drag queens, aromatherapists. What's most important is that you are framing your practice as an art practice, right? So we don't fund, for example, social service work. But whatever your practice is, however you make work and change in the world, if you're framing it as an art practice, um, and can speak to to the artwork that is created, then you're eligible to apply for this award, right? In terms of who makes the decisions, it's made by a rotating peer panel of community-based artists and cultural producers. More recently, also nonprofit workers, um, that are all very trusted and vetted by previous panelists in the Leeway community, right? I want to say we accept applications in both English and Spanish, and I want to highlight that anytime we're doing translation, when we get an application in another language, we are working with translators in our community. We never use AI to translate work, to translate your words, right? So just want to make that note. And then now let's talk specifically about the Transformation Award. It is a $15,000 unrestricted award for women, trans, and or gender nonconforming artists and cultural producers living in our funding region who create art for social change and have done so for the past 5 years or more. And that's really important because if you have 3 to 4 years of doing art for social change work, I highly, highly encourage you to take another year or two to continue developing your practice because we do read for you to talk about at least 5 years of work in your application. If we do not see 5 years of work, your application will likely be ruled ineligible. So I want to just put that up front. There is a specific section of the application where we ask for dates, and I'll highlight that as we continue in the presentation. And then, of course, a photo of some of our lovely 2025 LTA awardees. Looking at the numbers, it says 10 to 12 awardees each year, but it's really 12 awardees each year. It is a two-stage application process, and the stage one deadline is May 15th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We accept applications online as well as hard copy. If you would like to submit via hard copy, you can find that online as a PDF. You can print it out and fill it out there. Um, as long as it's not about the postmark, it has to be in our office by the deadline, by May 15th at 11:59 p.m. So when we walk into the office the next morning, if it's not there, unfortunately, it did not get in on time. So after the stage one, we read for basic eligibility, of course, and then the rest are sent to panel. And from there, 30 people are invited to return to stage two of the process, which will ask for work samples. So I highly encourage you to think about what you might submit as a work sample when you are putting together your stage one application. And then the stage two deadline to submit those work samples is in September. Imran, can you tell us a bit about how you were putting together your application in terms of the work samples? Did you know what you were going to use as a work sample already, or how did you approach that?
Yeah, I think, and I can't remember the time limit on the work sample, and that was, you know, something I did have to like edit my film down to, but I
Hmm.
knew I was going to use the most recent work I had. But I will say one thing for me, just to your point about the 5 year requirement, it actually, for me, the hardest thing about this application was believing that I was an artist for 5 years or more. And it's not because I hadn't had been making films for like a long time, but then mostly I've been working in nonprofits and I've been writing freelance. And part of the work here was creating the story of my practice and seeing it as a practice and believing that it was real and worth supporting. And so even though I kind of knew which clip I was going to use because it was like the most recent film I made, it was harder. The harder part for me was telling the story of how I got there, and why I saw that as a culmination of something.
Yeah, yeah, you bring up a great point. And actually, I want to say you don't have to have, when I say 5 years, you don't have to, I guess, consider yourself like a full-time artist for those 5 years. As long as your practice is at least 5 years long, meaning that, there's been work done from, what is it, 2022 forward, you're eligible, right? Can you talk a little bit about, that's another great question is like maybe some people are like, I'm not sure if it's the right time for me to apply. Can you talk about how you decided it was the right time for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I very much was in a transformative moment, and still am, in the sense that I was leaving. I had decided I was going to leave a job I was in for a long time, um, to be an artist, and I was feeling like called to just try, and partially because of what was is happening in the world and kind of what we're up against and wanting to just commit myself to something. And so in that sense, this award actually like felt it brought out a lot in me, like even it just being called the transformation award. But yeah, I happen to be in a very like clear moment of I'm going to be leaving. I'm going to be trying to be an artist full time. So this is a moment I could use some support. And so I definitely put that in the application. I was like,
Yeah.
you know, this is coming up for me. So yeah, that's kind of led me to wanting to apply, even though I knew about Leeway for many years. This felt like the right moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The timing was worked out really, really well. Okay, so now kind of this is the drier part, but just going through basic eligibility. We require that you have lived at least for the past 2 years in our funding region. We'll ask for your previous address, your current address, and your previous address if you've lived there for less than 2 years. Everyone who applies to Leeway has to be at least 18 years old, has to self-identify as a woman, trans, and or gender nonconforming person, and of course has to have been creating art for social change for the past 5 years or more. And so I really want to highlight that, right? In terms of offering examples of your art for social change practice, you might offer an example of like a time you were creating art. But if that example is not tied to the overall art for social change practice you're otherwise articulating in your application, that's like a very loose thread. So, for example, let's say I am um, a painter who's doing a lot of community engaged work 2023 and on, but in 2022 I was only really doing very solitary work that didn't have much to do with community. That's kind of like borderline eligibility. It's a stronger application if you've been doing that community engaged work that you're articulating as part of your practice for a solid 5 years. In terms of who is not eligible, if you're a full-time student in an arts degree granting program, so if you're a full-time BFA student or MFA student, you are not eligible. If you are a part-time student in one of those programs, you are eligible. And if you are a full-time student in a non-arts degree granting program, you are eligible. I hope that's clear. If not, I can say that again. You can only receive the Transformation Award once in a lifetime, and you cannot have just gotten the Media Artist and Activist residency last year. Lastly, we do require if you are a previous Leeway grantee that you have turned in all previous reports at the time of the deadline. And I will be sharing this slideshow as well as the recording with everyone. So you'll have access to everything linked here. Okay, now getting to the application, asks for basic contact information and a short artist bio. The short artist bio is really kind of used more internally than anything else. It's a quick snapshot of who you are, and it lets us know exactly who we're looking at as we're paging through potentially many, many applications for the reviewers as well. Um, Next is your social change intents again. So this is a list of 1 to 3 issue areas that your work really focuses on. And then the third section is the experience page. And this essentially asks for 4 to 10 experiences that I kind of read as telling the story or the arc of your practice and how it was shaped over time, right? They can be personal experiences, professional experiences, artistic experiences, political experiences, anything that you've experienced that's brought you to making the work you're making today, right? Um, and then from those 4 to 10 experiences, you'll select one to serve as your highlighted experience, and you'll write about that one more in depth. We're not trying to recreate a resume or a CV here. I encourage you not to just list all of your accolades or like all of your gallery shows or anything like that. It really is a chance to tell us like just to balance the personal and the professional is my advice here. You're really, this is the first time other than like the short artist bio where the panel is now starting to get to know you. They're starting to become invested in you and your story and your work. And so the experience page is kind of like an introduction to you. I want to read one of Imran's experiences here just to show you how you can kind of use the full word count and really get specific here. From 2022 to 2024, Imran wrote, I wrote, directed, edited, and produced a short narrative film, The Difference Between Us, which explored the intersection of gender, sex, and race through the lens of romantic cinema. It premiered at Black Star and went on to screen at trans and queer festivals globally. I think that's a really beautiful example of the word count. You're telling us your role in the project, what the project was, what it was about, how you're framing the project for us, and then where it was distributed and seen, right? And so that's packing a lot of information. You have about 2 sentences worth, and so I really encourage you to get specific with your experiences. Don't just write, I wrote the movie, The Difference Between Us. That's really not giving anything to the panel to kind of hold on to. So the more specific you can get, the better. You're really starting to tell your story here. Imran, how did you approach the experience page?
Yeah, I think because you have a certain number of experiences you have to list, you can't write everything. I did really think about art for social change, so was thinking about which of the experiences I could, and I actually tried a bunch of different ones in the word count and then replaced them where I felt like, okay, that one I can't explain it well in this many words, and I thought about the community aspect. So I tried to put some examples in there that showed community engagement or impact, even if they weren't my most prestigious example. I just felt like it was easier to explain like the point of it and how it impacted people.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, right? It doesn't always have to be like your shiniest moments, your most prestigious moments. It's really about telling the story of your arc and like, yeah, like what are my more community engaged works, right? That speak to how I work as an artist in community. Like that's very helpful to include there. And then the next piece of the application is 6 narrative questions about your art for social change work, and we will break those down here. I'm going to kind of run through them. I will say some folks find them repetitive, but I think they're all pretty distinct. This isn't here. These are not the way these are written on this slide. This is not the exact wording of the questions, but it's kind of like getting to the heart of what each question means. So the first question is really a description of your art for social change practice, or at least the last 5 years, and how it's evolved over time. So maybe you've implemented some things over the past 5 years that have changed the shape of your work or the direction of your work, and the panel's curious about that. Like, how are you kind of iterating and innovating within your own practice? They also will not see work samples in this first stage of the application. So it's very important that you describe what the work looks like. What does it feel like to experience the work, right? So that's question one. Question two asks you to provide specific examples of projects or pieces of your work in the last 5 years and prior, if applicable, right? And here you're actually, I've seen people use bullet points in this section to kind of highlight specific works. I would really think about what are your strongest examples of work for social change and what are things that you might use as a work sample if you're invited back to stage two, right? This is a really great chance to give the panel a snapshot into what some of your work might look like. Question number 3 asks you about those social change intents. So you selected 1 to 3 social change intents from a list. And 3 asks you, how does your art create action around those social change intents? We don't define the social change intent for you, right? So we just say feminism. We don't specify a particular brand of feminism. We're kind of curious to hear about that from you. Do you subscribe to like, I don't know, first wave feminism, or do you subscribe to womanism, a more intersectional kind of feminism, right? And so there's space there for you to kind of tell us um, how you are, why you selected that social change intent and exactly what it means to you in your work, right? Question number 4 asks you about how you self-identify and how that influences your work. So how does your identity show up in your work? How does it influence the direction your work has taken, etc. Um, we don't ask you like to select from a list of how you self-identify. It's really about how you choose to describe yourself, and how that identity plays a role in your work, right? Question number 5 asks you about the community or communities that your work engages and how they are engaged. So, what does that look like? What are some examples of how people engage with your work? How do you approach people to engage with your work? How do you collaborate, right? You can talk about all of those collaborative aspects in question number 5. And lastly, question number 6 is, what is the impact of your work in Philadelphia, in our funding region, essentially, and how it's being measured, if applicable? We know not everyone might not have data, they might not have numbers, but there are many different ways of speaking to the impact your work has had, right? Sometimes people use testimonials here. Sometimes people use times they've been invited by community to share their work. I think that speaks volumes um, towards how people see your work, how trusted you are in communities, etc. So I hope that was helpful. Imran, I want to bring you back in here. Can you talk about how you approached the narrative section of the application and how you started building the story of your application?
Yeah, I mean, I think it took a long time. I think, uh, one thing, because we had the experience section and then this part, I did try to think of like, were there things I didn't want to be necessarily repetitive. I do want to expand on some things that I brought up in the experience section so that I could like, I was imagining someone reading it consecutively. So that helped. I think, there were places where, um, I leaned into, as you were mentioning, like describing the film. I was very conscious of that fact of like, as someone, as primarily a filmmaker, I was like, and I'm writing here, and you don't get to see it. I have
Mhm.
to make it sound cool, and and that's where I spent a lot of work. I think in the first question, especially, I tried to really um, almost set you up for watching it if I made it that far, like so that you would have a vision before you even saw it. In hopes that that would help understand what I was trying to convey. Um, and then, yeah, last thing I'll say is that the question about impact is challenging. I think I've screened at some film festivals. I could say like how many people went there, but I tried to think about. I actually use like an individual, like people sending me emails, or like as an example. I didn't actually quote them, but that's how I know that a film made some impact, even if it was just a couple of people. But I also included an example where I wrote something and something changed in Philly because of something I wrote. I tried to um, show a variety of impacts.
Yeah, I think that's a great tactic, is kind of balancing like this is maybe a lot, something like, I mean, I've seen people say like they've influenced policy change and things like that in communities and then balancing that out with testimonials. Yeah, a lot of times people will say like, oh, I had this individual come up and talk to me, which is just one person, but then when it's consistently happening, it's like a consistent reaction that people have to your work and wanting to share something that they felt because they engaged with your work, then it kind of becomes a larger pattern, right? That can speak to your impact. Yeah, and I remember in question one also, you named your inspirations and influences, which I think is also very helpful. I think that gives the panel something to kind of hold on to, and they start to understand like, oh, this is like I understand a little bit more about like your analysis. Who's kind of influencing you in your thinking, right? And so that's very helpful too. Because the panel is curious, like what legacies are you working within? Okay, getting to the end here, just some things to remember. Again, stage one is just a written application, no work samples, so do a lovely job of describing your work. Some really great advice that I heard at last week's information session is definitely share well, one, don't rush, but two, share a draft of your application with people in your community and people who know your work, but also share it with people who don't know your work, who maybe don't identify as artists or creative people at all. I think you want to get their perspective. Like, do they understand what you're writing about? Can they visualize the work based on how you're describing it? I think that's often really helpful because if it's someone that's very close to us and who knows our work, they might not see the like any missing pieces the way that someone who's unfamiliar with your work might. So I thought that was a really good tip. If you're invited back to stage two, you will provide those work samples. Keep those in mind when you're writing your stage one application. Another thing to keep in mind that only two Transformation Award panelists are going to be from the Philly area. So I say that to say that not everyone on the panel will have like the local Philly context, right? So they might not understand the difference between like, I don't know, showcasing at like the Kimmel Center versus like showcasing at like, I don't know, like the Italian market or like a small gallery space or Vox. Like they might not understand if you just name like name drop those places, like the context surrounding them, like the different communities that are a part of those neighborhoods or venues. So try to include that context. Try to read your application draft through with the lens of someone who might not have like all of that Philly context. Okay, and that kind of brings us to the end. Imran, is there anything else you would like to share with folks as they possibly prepare their LTA applications?
Um, I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, like I had a hard time believing that I was I was going to get this. So part of how I approached the app was also like I feel so aligned with Leeway's mission as someone who like cares deeply about the subject areas that I marked. Like I took it as an opportunity to talk freely and passionately about the things I care about and the work I'm doing, so that if because as many of you probably are also doing, applying to lots of things, but this is one of the applications where I feel like I didn't have to make myself fit it as much. It like already fit me, and that was actually useful. I made a Google Doc or like a document where I saved everything and all my answers are, uh, I keep using them. So, and in that sense, it would, even if I hadn't gotten it, obviously it's amazing, but, it's not a lot of the grants I apply to are annoying and weird and ask you to put yourself into boxes, you know. And here I felt like it was an opportunity to not have to do that as much. I don't know if that's helpful, but also, yeah, if you're here, you probably deserve it. So it's just a matter of whether some people get it and some people don't. So yeah.
100%. There's never enough funding, as there are, um, I don't know, worthy applicants, people that are so deserving of this award, right? It's always hard to narrow it down to just 12 folks from an incredible batch. I also want to echo what you said about leaving, like kind of leaving the grant speak at the door. You can come as you are, you can write in your own voice. We see people show up with flair and attitude and poetry in their applications, and that's all very welcomed. The panel wants to get to know you for you and why the work you're doing is important to you, right? And so you don't have to sugarcoat, you don't have to say it in any particular way. It really is a come as you are application. So I know we're ending a little bit early. I want to one let folks know that we do have we offer one-on-one applicant support, and so that's a session where you can meet with a member of Leeway staff, either virtually or in person. And Maria, if you could drop those in the chat if you haven't already, just a link to our Luma page where you can register for those. If those times don't work for you, please reach out to either me or Maria or info@leeway.org, and we can certainly accommodate you at another time. But for now, I will, so we have some time, so why don't we open it up for questions?